Hey everyone. Tonight we journey into the shadowy depths of medieval Europe, where survival wasn't just challenging. The brutal reality about medieval life will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about knights, castles, and simpler times. Forget everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. You wouldn't last 12 hours, let alone a full day. The harsh truth is that medieval Europe was essentially a 1,000-year-long endurance test, designed by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humour and an apparent hatred for human comfort. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, dim the lights if you can, and let's embark on tonight's journey through medieval misery together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1347, somewhere in rural England. You're a peasant, which means you're already losing at life before you even open your eyes. Your bed isn't a bed, it's a pile of straw on the floor that you share with your entire family, plus whatever livestock decided to wander inside for warmth. The straw is damp, mouldy, and hasn't been changed in months because apparently the concept of hygiene hadn't been invented yet. You try to stretch and immediately regret it. Your spine cracks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Your joints ache constantly because you've been sleeping on what amounts to a compost pile, and your back feels like it's been used as a medieval torture device. Which, let's be honest, it basically has been. The air inside your hovel is a fragrant symphony of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray isn't mold, but know in your soul probably is. Your one-room house doesn't have windows, just holes in the wall that you cover with whatever you can find when the weather gets truly miserable. The smell is so thick you could practically chew it, and breathing feels like drowning in a bog made of expired cheese. You stumble toward what passes for a bathroom, which is really just a hole in the ground behind your house. Medieval toilets were basically just pits with a wooden seat over them, and the smell hits you like a physical assault. You wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or if you're feeling especially indulgent, a scrap of wool, which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet. Your morning routine includes checking your body for the various creatures that have decided to make you their home. Lice are basically your roommates at this point. They've set up permanent residence in your hair, your clothes, and probably your soul. Fleas bounce around like tiny medieval gymnasts, and you've got rashes in places you didn't know could develop rashes. Your skin is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. But you still haven't faced breakfast, and that's where medieval Europe really shows its creativity in human suffering. Your breakfast consists of whatever didn't rot overnight, which isn't much. If you're lucky, you get a chunk of bread that's roughly the consistency of a brick, and about as nutritious. The bread is dark, dense, and often contains things that definitely shouldn't be in bread, like sand, sawdust, and occasionally small rocks. Most meals taste like wet burlap, sprinkled with sadness. Your ale, because water will literally kill you, tastes like someone filtered it through a medieval sock and then added a generous helping of disappointment. The alcohol content is barely enough to make you forget your misery, but just enough to give you a constant low-level headache that feels like tiny medieval hammers are working on your skull. If you're particularly fortunate, you might get some porridge made from oats that have seen better centuries. The consistency is somewhere between glue and regret, and the taste makes you question every life choice that led you to this moment. You eat it anyway because the alternative is starving, and medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for its abundant food options. Your teeth, assuming you still have any, are basically decorative at this point. They're brown, cracked, and most of them hurt constantly. Your smile looks like something pulled from a haunted crypt, and chewing anything harder than mush is an exercise in creative pain management. Results varied, but the patient usually didn't. But you still haven't gotten dressed, and that's where the real fun begins. Your clothes aren't clothes. They're basically wearable torture devices made from materials that seem specifically designed to make you miserable. Your tunic is made from wool that feels like wearing a hair shirt made of disappointed sheep. It's scratchy, it's never been washed properly, and it smells like it's been marinating in medieval despair for several seasons. Your pants, if you can call them that, are essentially leg-shaped sacks held up by hope and a piece of rope. They're loose, uncomfortable, and provide about as much protection from the elements as a medieval politician's promise. The fabric is rough enough to sand wood, and every step feels like you're wearing sandpaper underwear. Your shoes are leather contraptions that were probably made by someone who had never seen a human foot before. They're stiff, uncomfortable, and leak like a medieval politician's secrets. Your feet are constantly wet, cold, and covered in blisters that have their own blisters. Walking isn't transportation, it's a slow-motion endurance test that makes you question the basic concept of mobility. And we haven't even talked about underwear yet, because congratulations, it doesn't exist. You're essentially wearing your outer clothes directly against your skin, which means every itch, every scratch, every uncomfortable moment is amplified tenfold. Your crotch is a war zone, and peace negotiations have been suspended indefinitely. Welcome to medieval employment, where your job isn't a career, it's a slow-motion disaster that somehow keeps you alive just long enough to suffer through another day. Your work begins before dawn, because apparently medieval Europe operated on the principle that sleep was for the weak and the dead. You're a farmer, which means you get to spend your day bent over in fields, doing back-breaking labor with tools that seem designed by someone who actively hated agricultural progress. Your plow is basically a sharp stick attached to a wooden frame, pulled by an ox that's probably smarter than half the people in your village. The soil is hard, rocky, and filled with things that want to destroy your farming equipment, which is basically just you and your medieval rage against the earth. You spend hours hunched over, pulling weeds by hand, because herbicides haven't been invented yet. Your back screams in agony. Your hands are covered in cuts and blisters, and your knees feel like they're filled with broken glass and medieval disappointment. Every movement is a negotiation with pain, and you're losing every negotiation. The sun beats down on you like a medieval punishment device, and you're wearing wool in weather that would make a modern person immediately seek air conditioning. You sweat profusely, but you can't take off your clothes because that would be indecent, and medieval Europe took its modesty very seriously, even while everyone was slowly dying of heat exhaustion. Your lunch break consists of eating whatever you can find in the field, which might be a raw turnip or some berries that may or may not be poisonous. Medieval dining was a bold business, and results varied considerably. You wash it down with warm ale that tastes like liquid disappointment and makes you question every decision your ancestors made that led to this moment. But you still haven't experienced medieval weather, and that's where things get truly medieval. Medieval weather wasn't just weather, it was a personal vendetta against human comfort. Rain doesn't just fall, it attacks with the fury of 1,000 medieval storms. Your roof leaks, like a medieval politician's promises, and your house floods regularly, because proper drainage is apparently a luxury reserved for the afterlife. When it's cold, it's not just cold, it's the kind of cold that makes you question the basic concept of warmth. Your house has no insulation, no proper heating, and the fire in your fireplace produces more smoke than heat. You huddle around it like a medieval worship service, praying to whatever gods might be listening that you don't freeze to death before morning. Your winter clothes are basically the same as your summer clothes, but damper and more miserable. You layer everything you own, which isn't much, and you still feel like you're slowly freezing from the inside out. Your fingers are numb, your toes have lost all feeling, and your nose runs constantly, creating a delightful combination of snot and despair. When it's hot, it's not just hot. It's the kind of heat that makes you wonder if medieval Europe was actually just a large outdoor oven designed to slowly cook peasants. Your wool clothes become medieval torture devices, and you sweat through every layer while still being required to maintain medieval modesty standards. The humidity is oppressive, and everything you own is constantly damp. Your clothes never fully dry, your bedding is perpetually moist, and you live in a state of permanent clamminess that makes you feel like you're slowly dissolving into medieval misery. If you thought the weather was bad, medieval healthcare will make you long for those simpler times when your biggest problem was just being uncomfortable. Medieval medicine is really just educated guessing, with a healthy dose of superstition and a complete misunderstanding of how the human body works. Your local physician learned his craft by reading ancient texts that were wrong about pretty much everything, and practicing on poor people who couldn't afford to complain when the treatment killed them. Feeling sick? Congratulations, you get to experience bloodletting, which is exactly what it sounds like. Your doctor will cut you open and drain your blood, because apparently medieval medicine operated on the principle that the problem with sick people was that they had too much blood. Results varied, but the patient usually didn't. Got a headache? Time for some trepanation, which involves drilling holes in your skull to let the evil spirits out. Your head isn't just hurting, it's about to become a medieval construction project. The success rate was roughly equivalent to flipping a coin, except the coin was cursed and the person flipping it was drunk. Broken bone? Your medieval doctor will set it using splints made from whatever wood is handy, and bandages that were probably used on the last patient who died from infection. Pain management consists of biting down on a leather strap and hoping you pass out before the procedure is finished. Infection. Your wound gets treated with poultices made from herbs, animal dung, and whatever else your doctor thinks might help. Medieval wound care was basically throwing random organic matter at the problem and hoping something worked. Antibiotics hadn't been invented yet, so your immune system was basically fighting a war with medieval weapons against modern diseases. Your teeth hurt constantly, and dental care consists of having them pulled out with pliers by someone whose primary qualification was owning a pair of pliers. No anesthesia, no proper tools, just raw medieval determination and a complete disregard for patient comfort. Your mouth isn't getting fixed, it's getting medieval. But you still haven't experienced the joy of medieval social interactions, and that's where things get truly special. Medieval social hierarchy means you're at the bottom of a very tall ladder, and everyone above you is actively trying to kick you off. You're a peasant, which means you're essentially medieval property. Your lord owns you, your land, your animals, and pretty much everything else in your life, except your ability to suffer, and even that belongs to God. You can't leave your village without permission, you can't marry without approval, and you can't even die without making sure your feudal obligations are met first. Your life isn't your own, it's a medieval rental agreement with terms that heavily favour the landlord. Your social interactions consist mainly of bowing to people who are better than you, which is basically everyone. You spend your day saying "yes, my lord," and "no, my lord" to people who view you as slightly more valuable than livestock, and that's only because livestock can't work the fields. The church controls everything, and medieval Christianity wasn't exactly known for its tolerance of fun. Dancing is sinful, singing is suspicious, and pretty much any activity that might bring you joy is probably a direct path to eternal damnation. Your entertainment consists of watching public executions and hoping the weather doesn't kill you before you can see the next one. Your neighbours are just as miserable as you are, which means social gatherings are basically group therapy sessions where everyone compares their various forms of suffering. Conversation topics include whose children died most recently, which diseases are spreading through the village, and whether the latest tax increase will finally be the one that kills everyone. And just when you think you've experienced the full spectrum of medieval misery, you remember that you still have to survive the night. Medieval nights are when all the day's problems get together and throw a party in your hovel. The temperature drops, the wind picks up, and every gap in your walls becomes a personal air conditioning unit designed by someone who hated warmth. You huddle in your damp straw bed, listening to the sounds of medieval nightlife, which consists mainly of people coughing, animals making disturbing noises, and the occasional scream from someone who's discovered that their medieval problems have gotten worse. Your house creaks and groans like it's slowly dying, which it probably is. The walls shift, the roof leaks, and everything you own is gradually returning to the earth from which it came. You're not living in a house, you're inhabiting a slow-motion collapse that you call home. Sleep is fitful because your bed is uncomfortable, your blanket is scratchy, and your pillow is basically a sack of whatever you could find. You dream of warmth, comfort, and food that doesn't taste like punishment, but you wake up to the same medieval reality that greeted you yesterday. The church bell clangs in the distance. The medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. It's calling you to prayer, which is mandatory, and to another day of medieval existence, which is also mandatory. But wait, there's more medieval magic waiting for you, because you haven't experienced the true joy of medieval social gatherings and feast days yet. When the village decides to celebrate peace, which happens roughly once per season, if you're lucky, you get to experience medieval entertainment in all its questionable glory. Village festivals are basically opportunities for everyone to gather together and compare their various forms of suffering while drinking ale that tastes like liquid regret. The dancing consists of jumping around in circles while trying not to fall over in your terrible shoes. Medieval choreography was apparently designed by someone who had never seen human beings move before, and the music is provided by instruments that sound like they're being tortured. Your fiddle player learned his craft by making cats scream in rhythm, and results varied considerably. The food at these celebrations is the same terrible food you eat every day, except now it's served cold, and there's less of it because everyone has to share. Feast days in medieval times were really just regular hunger, with extra people around to watch you not eat enough. Your entertainment includes watching travelling performers who specialise in juggling, storytelling, and dying of various diseases they picked up on the road. Medieval comedy was basically people falling down and getting hurt, which wasn't really comedy since people were falling down and getting hurt all the time anyway. But you still haven't experienced the true terror of medieval personal hygiene, and that's where things get genuinely horrifying. Bathing in medieval times isn't bathing, it's a seasonal event that happens roughly as often as solar eclipses and is about as pleasant. You don't have a bathroom, you don't have hot water, and soap is basically a mythical substance that exists only in legends and the distant memories of ancient Romans. When you do bathe, which might be twice a year if you're particularly ambitious, you use a wooden tub filled with water that's been used by everyone else in your family first. By the time it's your turn, the water looks like medieval soup and contains more organic matter than the local swamp. Your soap is made from animal fat and ashes, and it smells like something that died and then was set on fire. It doesn't clean you so much as redistribute the dirt in more creative patterns across your body. Your skin after bathing looks like a medieval art project executed by someone who hated cleanliness. Your hair is washed with the same terrible soap, assuming it gets washed at all. Most of the time you just scrape the worst of the accumulated grime off with a wooden comb that doubles as a medieval torture device. Your scalp is an ecosystem unto itself, supporting various forms of life that have established permanent residence and probably pay taxes. Medieval deodorant consists of hoping the wind blows in the right direction and maybe rubbing some herbs on yourself that smell slightly better than human despair. Your armpits are chemical weapons, and your breath could knock out a medieval warhorse at 20 paces. Your fingernails are basically archaeological sites containing layers of medieval history. Under your nails you'll find dirt from last month's farming, food from yesterday's disappointing meal, and substances that defy classification by medieval science. Manicures hadn't been invented yet, so your hands look like they've been used to dig graves, which they probably have. But you still haven't experienced the joy of medieval family planning. And that's where medieval Europe really shows its commitment to making life as complicated as possible. Medieval reproduction is really just hoping you survive long enough to create more people who can also suffer through medieval existence. Pregnancy in medieval times isn't a blessed event. It's a 9-month endurance test, followed by a medical procedure that is roughly the same survival rate as medieval warfare. Childbirth happens at home with the assistance of a midwife, whose primary qualification is that she's delivered babies before, and most of them lived. Medieval obstetrics was a bold business, and results varied significantly. Pain management during labour consists of biting down on a leather strap and praying to whatever saints specialise in not dying during childbirth. Your medieval children aren't adorable bundles of joy, they're tiny survival machines designed to maybe live long enough to reproduce themselves. Child mortality is so high that you don't bother naming them until you're reasonably sure they'll survive their first winter. Medieval parenting was basically crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. Your children sleep in the same bed as you, eat the same terrible food as you, and work in the fields as soon as they're old enough to hold farming tools. Childhood in medieval times lasts roughly until age 7, at which point you become a small adult with all the responsibilities and none of the wisdom. Education consists of learning how to not die from the various things that want to kill you, which is a full-time curriculum in medieval Europe. Reading and writing are luxury skills reserved for priests and nobility, so your children learn practical subjects like how to identify which mushrooms won't kill you, and basic medieval suffering techniques. But you still haven't experienced the pure terror of medieval travel, and that's where things get truly adventurous. Travelling in medieval times isn't transportation. It's a form of extreme sport with a mortality rate that would make modern extreme sports look like medieval tea parties. Roads don't exist in any meaningful sense. They're basically suggestions carved into the landscape by people who had never heard of engineering. Your transportation consists of walking, which means every journey is measured not in distance, but in how many different ways you can injure your feet. Medieval shoes provide about as much protection as medieval politicians provide honesty, and every step is a negotiation with pain that you consistently lose. If you're particularly wealthy, you might own a horse, which is basically a medieval motorcycle that eats constantly, requires daily maintenance, and has its own opinions about where it wants to go. Your horse is probably smarter than you are, and definitely has better living conditions, which says something truly depressing about medieval social hierarchy. Travelling at night is essentially suicide with extra steps, because medieval roads are filled with bandits, wild animals, and holes that could swallow entire medieval families. Highway robbery isn't crime, it's a legitimate medieval profession with excellent job security and competitive benefits. Your travel accommodations consist of sleeping under trees, in haystacks, or if you're extremely fortunate, in inns that are basically medieval hostels run by people who specialize in overcharging for the privilege of sleeping on slightly cleaner straw. Medieval inns serve food that makes your regular terrible food look like medieval fine dining, and the beds are occupied by previous guests who may or may not still be alive. Innkeeping was a bold business, and guest satisfaction varied considerably, but you still haven't experienced the sheer joy of medieval legal system, and that's where medieval Europe really demonstrates its commitment to creative problem solving. Medieval justice isn't justice, it's entertainment for people who find public executions relaxing. Your legal system operates on the principle that might makes right, and if you can't afford might, you're probably wrong by default. Getting arrested in medieval times means you're guilty until proven wealthy enough to buy your innocence. Your trial consists of various tests designed to determine whether God likes you, including trial by combat, trial by ordeal, and trial by whether you can afford a better lawyer than the person accusing you. Trial by ordeal involves doing things like sticking your hand in boiling water or carrying red-hot iron, and if you don't get injured, it means you're innocent. Medieval legal logic was apparently designed by people who had never met God but were confident they knew exactly how divine intervention worked. Your medieval prison isn't a rehabilitation center. It's a place where people go to die more slowly than they would through regular execution. Medieval dungeons are essentially underground suffocation chambers with a medieval torture device, theme and food that would make your regular terrible food weep with envy. Medieval punishment for crimes ranges from public humiliation to creative execution methods designed by people who had way too much time to think about inventive ways to kill people. Your medieval executioner isn't just doing a job, he's an artist whose medium is human suffering and whose canvas is your rapidly disappearing life. But you still haven't experienced the pure existential horror of medieval religion, and that's where things get truly medieval. Medieval Christianity isn't just religion, it's a comprehensive life management system designed to make sure you feel guilty about everything you've ever done, thought about doing, or might do in the future. Your relationship with God is basically a medieval customer service experience where you're always wrong and the manager is never available. Church attendance isn't optional, it's mandatory, and the services are conducted in Latin, which you don't understand. You spend hours standing in drafty stone buildings, listening to priests explain why everything you enjoy is probably sending you directly to hell. Medieval sermons were basically hour-long lectures about why you should feel worse about your already terrible life. Your medieval church doesn't have heating, comfortable seating, or any amenities that might make the experience bearable. Stone floors, stone walls, and stone benches create an atmosphere that makes you feel like you're already dead and just waiting for the paperwork to be processed. Confession involves telling a priest about all the terrible things you've done, which in medieval times includes basically everything, because medieval Christianity had very strict definitions of sin. Enjoying food is gluttony, sleeping too much is sloth, and having any positive emotions about anything is probably pride. Medieval penance for your sins involves doing things like pilgrimage, which means walking hundreds of miles to visit religious sites while wearing uncomfortable shoes and eating even worse food than usual. Pilgrimage was basically medieval tourism for people who hated themselves and wanted to suffer in exotic locations. But you still haven't experienced the true terror of medieval warfare. And that's where medieval Europe really shows its creativity in organized human suffering. Medieval warfare isn't strategic military operation. It's basically large-scale violence conducted by people wearing metal clothing and wielding sharp objects with questionable effectiveness. Your medieval army consists of peasants who have been handed weapons and told to go stab people they've never met for reasons they don't understand. Your medieval weapons are farming tools that someone decided would be good for killing people. Your sword is heavy, unwieldy, and requires more maintenance than a medieval marriage. Your armor is metal clothing designed by someone who had never heard of mobility or comfort, and wearing it is like being wrapped in a medieval heating system that only produces heat when you don't want it. Medieval battles are essentially group brawls with weapons, and strategy consists of pointing everyone in the same direction and hoping for the best. Communication during battle involves shouting over the sound of metal, hitting metal, which is roughly as effective as medieval everything else. Your chances of surviving medieval warfare depend largely on whether you can run faster than the other peasants, whether your armor actually protects you from anything, and whether the people trying to kill you are more incompetent than you are. Medieval military tactics were a bold business, and results varied dramatically. But even if you survive the battle, you still have to deal with medieval wound care, which brings us back to medieval medicine and its creative approaches to keeping people alive just long enough to die from something else. Your day in medieval times isn't a day. It's a survival challenge designed by someone with an advanced degree in human suffering and a minor in creative torture. Every hour brings new opportunities for misery. Every task is a negotiation with pain that you consistently lose, and every moment is a reminder that you're living in an era when comfort was a luxury reserved for the afterlife and basic human dignity was apparently too expensive for peasants. You wouldn't last a day in medieval times, not because you're weak, but because medieval times were essentially a 1,000-year-long endurance test that most people somehow managed to survive through a combination of stubbornness, ignorance, religious terror, and sheer medieval determination. Medieval life was like being trapped in a survival horror game designed by someone who actively hated the concept of survival. Medieval Europe wasn't a simpler time. It was a complex arrangement of suffering, survival, social oppression, religious guilt, and the occasional miracle that kept humanity going long enough to eventually invent things like soap, proper medicine, indoor plumbing, and the radical concept that maybe people shouldn't have to live in constant misery just because they weren't born wealthy. Your medieval existence was basically a daily reminder that life could always get worse, and it usually did. Every medieval innovation in comfort was immediately followed by 3 new forms of suffering that no one had thought of before. Results varied, but somehow, against all odds and medieval logic, people survived long enough to eventually create a world where waking up doesn't immediately involve checking for parasites, wondering if today's the day the plague finally catches up with you, or calculating whether you have enough energy to survive another day of medieval existence. Medieval times were a bold business, and frankly, it's a miracle any of us are here to talk about it. The fact that humanity survived medieval Europe long enough to evolve into a species that complains about slow internet and cold coffee is perhaps the greatest achievement in human history. Picture this. It's 1450, somewhere in rural France, and you've just settled down for what you optimistically call sleep on what you generously call a bed. Congratulations, you're about to experience 8 hours of medieval suffering disguised as rest, where your mattress is essentially composting organic matter and your pillow is whatever didn't crawl away when you weren't looking. Your bed isn't a bed, it's a carefully arranged pile of straw that you've convinced yourself counts as furniture. This straw isn't fresh, golden wheat stalks, like you might imagine. This is months old, partially decomposed plant matter that's been slept on by your entire family, various farm animals, and probably several generations of mice who've established a thriving civilization in your sleeping arrangements. The straw crunches when you move, which wouldn't be so bad, except it crunches constantly, because medieval straw beds were basically giant noise machines designed by someone who hated the concept of quiet sleep. Every time you shift position, roll over, or breathe too heavily, your bed sounds like you're wrestling with a scarecrow in a thunderstorm. You lie down and immediately feel individual pieces of straw poking through the thin cloth covering that's supposed to protect you from direct straw contact. These aren't gentle nudges, these are sharp, persistent jabs from plant stalks that seem personally offended by your attempt to sleep on them. Your cloth covering is roughly the thickness of medieval optimism, which is to say, practically non-existent. Within minutes, you're playing a medieval game called Find a Position, where fewer than 10 pieces of straw are actively stabbing you. This game has no winners, only varying degrees of discomfort that range from mildly tortuous to questioning every life decision that led to this moment. Your straw mattress isn't flat. It's a lumpy landscape of agricultural hills and valleys that shift and rearrange themselves every time you move. What starts as a reasonably flat surface quickly becomes a topographical nightmare where your hip bone is resting on what feels like a medieval mountain range made of compressed plant matter. But you still haven't discovered the true horror of medieval straw bed ecology, and that's where things get genuinely fascinating in the worst possible way. Your straw bed isn't just sleeping material, it's a thriving ecosystem supporting more forms of life than a medieval rainforest. Mice have built elaborate tunnel systems throughout your mattress, and they're not quiet about their construction projects. Medieval rodent engineering apparently operates on a 24-hour schedule, and they're always working on home improvements right underneath your sleeping body. The mice aren't just living in your bed, they're raising families, holding meetings, and probably running small businesses. You can hear them scurrying around beneath you, having what sound like important mouse conversations about territory disputes and resource allocation. Your bed has become a medieval mouse metropolis, and you're the unwelcome giant who keeps disrupting their urban planning. But mice are just the beginning of your straw bed's biological diversity. Fleas have established permanent residence and treat your sleeping body like an all-night medieval buffet. They hop around like tiny acrobats, timing their feeding schedule to coincide with your deepest sleep phases. Medieval flea management was a bold business, and results varied from completely infested to utterly overwhelmed by parasites. Your straw is also home to various beetles, spiders, and insects that haven't been classified by medieval science, because medieval science was too busy being wrong about everything else. These creatures emerge at night like tiny medieval vampires, and they're all interested in either eating you, laying eggs in your clothing, or just generally making your sleeping experience as unpleasant as possible. The moths that live in your straw have developed sophisticated strategies for getting tangled in your hair while you sleep. You wake up with insects woven into your scalp like medieval hair accessories designed by someone who actively hated human comfort. Removing them requires careful medieval archaeology and often results in losing patches of hair that you couldn't afford to lose in the first place. But you still haven't experienced the aromatic symphony that is medieval straw bed fragrance, and that's where your sense of smell gets to join the suffering party. Your straw bed doesn't smell like fresh hay or country meadows. It smells like a combination of mouse urine, human sweat, mold, and something that might be decomposing food, but could also be decomposing everything else. The smell is so distinctive that medieval noses have developed specialized categories for different types of straw bed odors. When you first lie down, the smell hits you like a physical assault. It's not just unpleasant, it's aggressive. The odor seems to have its own personality, and that personality is committed to making sure you never forget that you're sleeping on what amounts to an indoor compost pile that occasionally doubles as furniture. The straw closest to your body has absorbed months of human emissions, sweat, tears, and various other fluids that medieval hygiene couldn't adequately address. This creates distinct aromatic zones in your bed. The head region smells like fermented scalp oil. The middle section has achieved a bouquet that combines body odor with agricultural decay, and the foot area has developed its own ecosystem of foot-related scents that would make a medieval tanner weep. As the night progresses and your body heat warms the straw, the smell intensifies. What started as merely offensive becomes overwhelming. You're not just sleeping on straw, you're marinating in a medieval aromatherapy experience designed by someone who confused relaxing with torturous. The moisture from your breathing and body heat creates a greenhouse effect in your straw bed, which accelerates the decomposition process. Your bed isn't just smelling bad, it's actively getting worse while you sleep on it. Medieval beds were basically fermentation vessels with delusions of furniture, but you still haven't experienced the true physical challenges of straw sleep, and that's where your body gets to learn new forms of medieval discomfort. Sleeping on straw isn't sleeping. It's an 8-hour endurance test disguised as rest. Your body weight compresses the straw unevenly, creating pressure points that seem specifically designed to target every bone, joint, and muscle that you use for basic human functions. Your hip bone, which was never designed to serve as a medieval drill bit, starts boring into the compressed straw beneath you. The straw pushes back with the determination of agricultural matter that has given up any pretense of comfort. Within an hour, your hip feels like it's being used as a medieval construction tool. Your shoulder blade discovers that straw beds have their own opinions about human anatomy, and those opinions are consistently negative. The straw creates a depression that's exactly the wrong shape for your shoulder, forcing your arm into positions that medieval torture experts would consider creative. Your spine, which spent the day being abused by medieval labor, gets to spend the night learning new forms of misalignment. Straw beds don't support your natural spinal curve. They create entirely new curves that your spine has never experienced and never wanted to experience. You wake up feeling like your backbone has been rearranged by medieval chiropractors who learnt their craft through trial and error, mostly error. Rolling over on a straw bed isn't a smooth movement. It's a complex negotiation with agricultural physics. The straw shifts and bunches under your weight, creating new lumps in unexpected places. What was a tolerable sleeping position 30 seconds ago becomes a landscape of discomfort that requires immediate evacuation. Your legs sink into the straw at different rates, depending on the density of the plant matter beneath them. This creates a sleeping position that resembles a human pretzel, except pretzels are symmetrical, and your straw bed has no interest in geometric consistency. Medieval sleep positions were basically yoga poses, designed by people who hated flexibility. But you still haven't experienced the temperature regulation nightmare that is straw bed thermal management. And that's where medieval sleep gets truly creative with discomfort. Straw beds have their own theories about appropriate sleeping temperature, and those theories are consistently wrong. In winter, your straw bed becomes a medieval refrigerator, disguised as bedding. The straw conducts cold like a medieval air conditioning system, designed by someone who actively hated warmth. Your body heat disappears into the straw like medieval magic, except instead of producing something useful, it just vanishes into the agricultural void beneath you. You generate warmth, the straw absorbs it, and you're left shivering on what amounts to a pile of frozen plant matter that's masquerading as a sleeping surface. The straw closest to the ground stays permanently cold because medieval floors were basically outdoor surfaces that happen to be inside. Cold seeps up through your mattress like medieval pneumonia, targeting your spine with precision that would impress medieval military strategists. In summer, your straw bed becomes a medieval heating system that operates on the principle that humans should be slowly cooked while they sleep. The straw traps your body heat and creates a microclimate that resembles a medieval greenhouse designed for growing human misery. You can't remove clothing because medieval modesty standards don't allow for practical sleeping arrangements. Instead, you marinate in your own sweat while the straw beneath you develops its own weather system. Medieval sleep was basically living in a personal sauna made of decomposing plant matter. The straw retains heat long after you've reached your maximum tolerance for warmth. Your bed becomes a medieval thermal battery that stores all the day's heat and releases it directly into your sleeping body throughout the night. You wake up feeling like you've been slow roasted by agricultural material with delusions of being a cooking surface. But you still haven't experienced the acoustic nightmare that is medieval straw bed sound management. And that's where your ears get to join the sensory assault. Every movement you make on your straw bed creates a symphony of agricultural noise that would wake the medieval dead if the medieval dead weren't already awake from their own straw bed experiences. The straw doesn't just crunch, it crackles, rustles, squeaks, and makes sounds that medieval science hasn't classified because medieval science was too busy being wrong about sound in general. Rolling over sounds like you're having a fight with a scarecrow. Sitting up creates a noise like breaking kindling. Simply breathing heavily produces rustling sounds that suggest your bed is slowly exploding in agricultural slow motion. Your family members sleeping in the same room, because medieval privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy dead. Get to experience your straw bed's acoustic properties throughout the night. Medieval bedrooms were basically concert halls where the featured performance was human versus agricultural matter, and the show ran continuously from sunset to dawn. The mice in your mattress contribute their own soundtrack of scurrying, squeaking, and what sounds like tiny medieval construction projects. They're not just living in your bed, they're renovating constantly. And medieval mouse construction operates on a 24-hour schedule with no regard for human sleep cycles. The fleas hopping around create their own percussion section, adding rhythmic elements to your straw bed's acoustic composition. Medieval sleep was basically trying to rest, while an orchestra of insects and rodents performed experimental music, using your mattress as their concert venue. But you still haven't experienced the clothing interaction nightmare that occurs when medieval fabric meets medieval straw. And that's where your wardrobe gets to participate in the suffering. Your medieval sleeping clothes, which are basically the same clothes you wore all day, because medieval people owned roughly 2 outfits, interact with straw in ways that would fascinate medieval scientists if medieval scientists weren't too busy being wrong about fabric physics. Individual pieces of straw work their way through the weave of your clothing like agricultural needles, with malicious intent. You wake up with straw embedded in your tunic, your pants, and places where straw has no business being. Medieval clothing was basically a collection system for plant matter that wanted to relocate to your body. The straw that penetrates your clothing doesn't just sit there politely, it twists, pokes, and irritates your skin throughout the night. You're not just wearing clothes, you're wearing a medieval torture device made of fabric and agricultural accessories that seem personally offended by your existence. Your medieval undergarments, which barely deserve the name, provide no protection from straw infiltration. Individual stalks work their way through multiple layers of clothing and establish direct contact with your skin. You wake up feeling like you've been acupunctured by an agricultural therapist who learned their craft through medieval trial and error. The rough straw snags on your clothing throughout the night, creating pulls and tears that reduce your already limited wardrobe. Medieval fashion was basically watching your clothes slowly disintegrate through contact with your sleeping arrangements. Your clothing budget competed directly with your bedding budget, and both were losing. But you still haven't experienced the wake-up process that concludes your straw bed experience. And that's where medieval mornings reveal the full scope of agricultural sleeping damage. Waking up on a straw bed isn't rising refreshed. It's conducting a medieval archaeological survey of your own body to assess the damage. You begin each day by cataloguing which body parts hurt in new and creative ways, which pieces of straw have become permanently embedded in your person, and whether you've lost any body parts to nocturnal agricultural warfare. Your hair resembles a medieval art project, created by someone who specialized in combining human follicles with plant matter. Removing the straw from your hair requires careful excavation techniques that often result in losing more hair than straw. Medieval morning hair care was basically controlled demolition of your scalp's ecosystem. Your clothes require a complete straw removal process that resembles harvesting in reverse. You spend the first hour of each day picking plant matter out of fabric, which would be meditative if the straw weren't attached to your skin, and fighting back against removal efforts. Your skin bears the impressions of individual straw pieces, like a medieval topographical map. You wake up with agricultural tattoos that fade throughout the morning, assuming you survive long enough for them to fade. Your body becomes a canvas for temporary art created by plant matter with artistic pretensions. The aches and pains from sleeping on compressed organic matter require a warming up period where you gradually convince your joints to remember how human movement works. Your spine needs to be reminded that it's supposed to be straight. Your hips need coaxing to support your body weight, and your shoulders require negotiation to resume their normal position. But you still haven't experienced the social aspects of communal straw bed living, and that's where medieval sleeping arrangements reveal their commitment to destroying any remaining privacy. Medieval bedrooms aren't private spaces, they're communal sleeping warehouses, where entire families share sleeping areas that wouldn't be adequate for a single modern person. Your straw bed isn't your personal sleeping space. It's a family accommodation that operates on the principle that privacy is a luxury reserved for the wealthy dead. You share your straw mattress with siblings, parents, and occasionally livestock that wander inside for warmth. Medieval bed sharing was basically human. Tetris played with family members who all smell like their own individual combinations of medieval working life. Your family's collective body heat, breathing, and nocturnal movements create a sleeping environment that resembles a medieval greenhouse designed for growing human discomfort. Everyone's straw bed problems become everyone else's straw bed problems, because medieval sleeping was a communal activity, whether you wanted community or not. The sounds of multiple people trying to sleep on agricultural matter create a symphony of suffering that continues throughout the night. Medieval bedrooms were basically concert halls where the featured performance was multiple humans versus multiple piles of plant matter, and every night was a sold-out show. Waking up involves coordinating with other family members to determine who gets to extract themselves from the communal straw pile first, who has the fewest pieces of plant matter embedded in their clothing, and whether anyone survived the night without developing new forms of agricultural-related discomfort. Your medieval straw bed experience isn't just sleeping, it's participating in a nightly endurance challenge designed by people who confused resting with surviving 8 hours of agricultural assault. Every night brings new opportunities to discover creative forms of plant matter-related suffering, and every morning requires recovery time from the restoration experience. Medieval sleep was a bold business where the goal wasn't comfort, refreshment, or actual rest, simply surviving until dawn, with most of your body parts still attached and functioning. Results varied considerably, but somehow people managed to get enough sleep to wake up and face another day of medieval existence, which suggests either incredible human adaptability or complete resignation to agricultural suffering. Straw beds in the 1400s weren't furniture, they were medieval survival challenges, disguised as sleeping arrangements, where rest was a luxury that existed only in the dreams of people too tired to dream properly. Medieval bedtime was basically an 8-hour agricultural experiment conducted on human subjects who had no choice but to participate in the research. The fact that people survived sleeping on straw long enough to eventually invent actual mattresses is perhaps the greatest achievement in the history of human persistence and agricultural problem solving. Medieval straw sleep was indeed a bold business, and results varied from barely tolerable to questioning the basic concept of horizontal rest. The year is 1790, and you're standing on a muddy street corner in Philadelphia, waiting for what passes as breaking news in an era when information travels at the speed of an exhausted horse. Forget everything you think you know about staying informed. You're about to experience news consumption in a world where getting updates about current events requires standing in literal filth while listening to a man with questionable hygiene shout information that may or may not be accurate. Your news source isn't a smartphone, a television, or even a newspaper delivered to your door. Your primary information delivery system is a town crier, essentially a human megaphone with lungs like a bellows and the social standing of someone whose job description is professional shouter. This person has walked miles through mud, horse manure, and colonial weather conditions to bring you news that's already weeks old by the time it reaches your ears. The street corner where you're gathering isn't a pleasant urban meeting space. It's basically an outdoor sewer with pretensions of being a public forum. The street is a mixture of mud, horse droppings, rotting food scraps, and liquids that you pray are just rainwater but suspect are something far more biological. Your shoes, assuming you own shoes, are immediately claimed by the colonial street surface, which operates like quicksand made of organic waste and civic neglect. Standing in this aromatic nightmare, you're surrounded by other colonists who smell like a combination of unwashed wool, wood smoke, and occupational hazards that colonial hygiene couldn't adequately address. Personal space is a luxury that hasn't been invented yet, so you're pressed against people whose last bath was roughly seasonal and whose clothing has achieved its own ecosystem. The crowd gathering for news consists of labourers who've taken time off from jobs that were slowly killing them, housewives who've left their colonial domestic disasters unattended, and various colonial professionals whose work uniforms are basically decorative dirt arranged in job-specific patterns. Everyone smells like their occupation, and colonial occupations were not known for their pleasant aromatic qualities. But you still haven't experienced the actual news delivery process, and that's where 1790 information technology really shows its commitment to making communication as unreliable as possible. Your town crier arrives, looking like he's been personally assaulted by the colonial road system. His clothing is mud-splattered, his boots are archaeological sites containing samples from every mile he's travelled, and his appearance suggests that delivering news in 1790 was basically a form of extreme sport with very low pay and no safety equipment. The crier doesn't just announce news, he performs it with the theatrical intensity of someone who understands that his audience's attention span is limited by how long they can stand in colonial street conditions without losing the will to live. Colonial news delivery was basically street theatre performed by people whose dramatic training consisted of learning to project their voice over the sound of colonial urban chaos. His voice, which has been trained through years of shouting over distance, weather, and colonial background noise, carries information with the clarity of someone yelling through a tunnel filled with mud. Every word requires effort to decipher, and you're never quite sure whether you heard the king has declared war or the king has declared war. The news itself arrives in a format that combines official proclamation with colonial gossip, filtered through multiple sources who may or may not have understood the original information. Your town crier isn't just delivering facts, he's passing along information that's been processed through a colonial telephone game involving dozens of people who had their own interpretations of what they heard. Colonial news accuracy was a bold business, and results varied considerably depending on how many people the information had passed through, how many of them could actually read, and whether anyone along the chain had personal opinions they wanted to add to the official facts. But you still haven't experienced the content of colonial news, and that's where 1790 current events reveal their commitment to making modern news cycles look lightning fast and comprehensively detailed. The news you're hearing isn't breaking news. It's thoroughly broken news that's been shattered by time, distance, and colonial communication limitations. Information about events that happened weeks ago is presented as current updates, and you're expected to be excited about developments that may have already been resolved, escalated, or completely forgotten by the time you hear about them. Your colonial news update might include information like tensions are rising with Britain, which in 1790 could mean anything from a minor diplomatic disagreement to full-scale war preparations. Colonial news was basically horoscopes with political implications, where vague statements were interpreted according to your personal level of anxiety about international relations. Economic news consists of reports about trade disruptions, currency problems, and commercial developments that affect colonial life in ways that won't become clear until months later when you're personally experiencing the consequences. Your colonial economic forecast was basically someone shouting general warnings about problems that you couldn't prevent or prepare for anyway. Political news involves updates about government decisions made by people you've never met, in places you've never been, regarding policies that will affect your life in ways that nobody fully understands yet. Colonial democracy was basically government by distant rumour, where citizen participation consisted of hearing about decisions after they'd already been implemented. Military news includes reports about conflicts that may or may not still be happening, involving armies that could be anywhere, with outcomes that range from probably fine to potentially catastrophic. Colonial military intelligence was a bold business where intelligence was often the missing ingredient. But you still haven't experienced the social dynamics of colonial news consumption. And that's where street corner information gathering reveals its commitment to combining civic engagement with class warfare. Your fellow news consumers aren't just random citizens, they're representatives of colonial social hierarchy, all pressed together in democratic street filth. Wealthy merchants stand next to indentured servants, skilled craftsmen crowd against day labourers, and everyone pretends that colonial social distinctions don't matter while carefully maintaining every possible form of subtle class discrimination. The wealthy colonists attending street corner news sessions are slumming it, participating in public information gathering, because even colonial elite can't afford private news delivery services. They stand in the same mud as everyone else, but they manage to convey their superiority through posture, clothing quality, and strategic positioning that keeps them upwind from the more aromatic members of colonial society. Working-class colonists treat news gathering as a social event where they can complain about colonial working conditions, colonial economic policies, and colonial life in general. Street corner news was basically group therapy disguised as civic engagement, where people could collectively express their dissatisfaction with colonial existence while pretending to care about international politics. The conversations that develop around news announcements reveal colonial political sophistication, which ranged from surprisingly informed to completely wrong about everything. Colonial political discourse was conducted by people who had strong opinions about events they couldn't influence, involving people they'd never met, in places they'd never visit. Arguments break out regularly because colonial political discussions operated on the principle that volume could substitute for accuracy, and everyone had access to incomplete information that they were confident was absolutely correct. Colonial political debates were basically shouting contests where everyone was wrong, but nobody was willing to admit it. But you still haven't experienced the physical challenges of colonial news consumption. And that's where Standing on Street Corners in 1790 reveals its commitment to making information gathering an endurance sport. The weather during your news gathering session doesn't just affect your comfort, it actively assaults your ability to hear, understand, or care about the information being delivered. Colonial weather was basically a personal vendetta against outdoor activities, and news delivery was definitely an outdoor activity. Rain turns your street corner into a colonial mud wrestling arena, where staying upright requires constant negotiation with colonial physics. The mud doesn't just get on your shoes, it claims your entire lower body and threatens to establish permanent residence. Your clothing becomes a colonial absorbent system that soaks up street water, atmospheric moisture, and liquids of unknown origin. Wind carries the town crier's voice in directions that have nothing to do with where you're standing, so you get random fragments of news mixed with sounds from colonial urban life. You might hear the president has decided, followed by the sound of a horse neighing, followed by taxes on imported, followed by someone's colonial coughing fit. Cold weather turns news gathering into a colonial endurance test, where staying long enough to hear complete information requires risking colonial frostbite. Your fingers lose feeling, your feet become numb, and your face hurts from exposure to colonial winter conditions that don't care about your need to stay informed. Hot weather transforms your street corner into a colonial sauna, where colonial clothing becomes a personal torture device. And standing in crowds of unwashed colonists creates an aromatic experience that challenges your commitment to civic engagement. Colonial summer news gathering was basically voluntary suffering with educational benefits, but you still haven't experienced the information verification challenges that come with colonial news consumption. And that's where 1790 fact-checking reveals its creative approach to accuracy. Verifying colonial news isn't fact-checking, it's hoping that someone in the information chain actually understood what they heard and passed it along without adding their own creative interpretations. Colonial information accuracy operated on the honor system, implemented by people whose honor was often questionable and whose understanding was frequently limited. Your town crier's sources include other town criers, travelers who may or may not have been paying attention, government officials who may or may not have been telling the truth, and colonial gossip networks that specialized in turning minor incidents into major catastrophes. Colonial news sources were basically a game of telephone played by people who weren't sure what a telephone was. Contradictory information arrives regularly because different news sources had different versions of the same events, and reconciling these differences required colonial investigative skills that most people hadn't developed. You might hear that a battle was won on Tuesday and lost on Wednesday, and colonial logic suggested that both reports could somehow be simultaneously accurate. Colonial newspapers, when available, contained information that was weeks old and had been filtered through colonial printing technology operated by people whose literacy was often debatable. Reading colonial newspapers was basically archaeological research into information that may have been accurate when it was originally printed, assuming it was ever accurate at all. Rumor verification required asking other colonists what they'd heard, which created circular information systems where everyone was confirming the same inaccurate details with each other. Colonial rumour verification was basically an echo chamber made of colonial confusion and mutual misunderstanding. But you still haven't experienced the economic implications of colonial news consumption. And that's where street corner information gathering reveals its impact on colonial time management and productivity. Taking time to hear news means leaving whatever colonial work was slowly killing you, which represents lost income in an economy where missing work could mean missing meals. Colonial news consumption was basically choosing between staying informed and staying fed, and both choices had significant drawbacks. The information you gather may affect your colonial business decisions, trade relationships, and economic planning in ways that won't become clear until you've already committed to courses of action based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Colonial economic planning was basically gambling with incomplete cards while blindfolded. News about trade disruptions, currency changes, or political developments could make your colonial livelihood obsolete overnight, but the information arrives too late to help you prepare for the changes. Colonial economic adaptation was basically running behind a train while trying to jump on cars that were already leaving the station. Your colonial investment decisions, assuming you had anything to invest, were based on information that was already outdated when you received it. Colonial financial planning was a bold business where timing was everything, and timing was impossible to achieve. The cost of staying informed included not just lost work time, but also the physical wear and tear of standing in colonial street conditions, the clothing damage from colonial weather, and the social costs of associating with colonial information seekers who might have questionable reputations. But you still haven't experienced the follow-up challenges that come after colonial news consumption. And that's where processing 1790 information reveals its commitment to making understanding as difficult as receiving. After hearing colonial news, you're expected to form opinions about complex political, economic, and military situations based on incomplete information delivered by questionable sources in inadequate formats. Colonial civic engagement was basically making important decisions while blindfolded in a room full of people shouting contradictory advice. Discussing the news with other colonists reveals the full scope of colonial information interpretation, which ranged from surprisingly sophisticated to completely detached from reality. Colonial political discussions were conducted by people who had passionate opinions about situations they couldn't fully understand, involving people they'd never met. Your colonial vote, when voting was allowed, was based on information that may or may not have been accurate, regarding candidates you may or may not have understood, for positions that may or may not have been important to your daily life. Colonial democracy was basically guessing contests with constitutional implications. Planning your colonial life around news developments required making long-term decisions based on short-term information that might be completely wrong. Colonial life planning was basically building houses on foundations made of rumours and hoping the construction would outlast the next information update. The practical impact of colonial news on daily life often didn't become clear until weeks or months later, when the real consequences of distant events finally reached your colonial corner of the world. Colonial cause and effect operated on timelines that made planning impossible and adaptation essential. But you still haven't experienced the broader context of what news consumption meant in a world where information was a luxury commodity. And that's where 1790 communication reveals its fundamental challenges. Being informed in colonial America wasn't a right or an expectation. It was a privilege available to people who had the time, money, and physical capability to seek out information in inconvenient locations under uncomfortable conditions. Colonial news access was basically a subscription service where you paid with your time, comfort, and patience. Most colonists lived their entire lives with limited access to information about events beyond their immediate community, making decisions based on local knowledge and hoping that distant developments wouldn't destroy their colonial planning. Colonial isolation was the default condition, and staying informed required extraordinary effort. The news you managed to hear represented a tiny fraction of actual events, filtered through multiple layers of colonial communication limitations and human interpretation errors. Your colonial worldview was basically a jigsaw puzzle, with most of the pieces missing and several of the remaining pieces from different puzzles entirely. International news reached colonial America months after events occurred, making colonial foreign policy opinions essentially historical commentary on situations that had already been resolved or dramatically changed. Colonial international awareness was basically discussing last season's sports while this season's championship was already over. Your colonial news consumption experience wasn't just getting information, it was participating in a primitive communication system that operated on the principle that something was better than nothing, even when that something was often wrong, incomplete, or useless. Colonial information technology was a bold business where the goal wasn't accuracy or timeliness, but simply moving some form of information from one place to another before everyone involved died of old age. Results varied considerably, but somehow colonists managed to stay informed enough to make the political, economic, and social decisions that eventually created a functioning democracy. Colonial news consumption was basically building civilization while only half understanding what was happening, which suggests either incredible colonial adaptability or extraordinary colonial luck. But you still haven't experienced the regional information disparities that made colonial news consumption even more unreliable. And that's where 1790 communication reveals its commitment to geographic discrimination. News reaching your Philadelphia street corner is relatively fresh compared to what people in frontier settlements receive, but relatively fresh in colonial terms means your information is only 2 weeks old instead of 2 months old. Colonial information freshness was basically a sliding scale of staleness, where everything was expired, but some news was more expired than others. Rural colonists receive information that has travelled through multiple colonial filtration systems, each adding their own creative interpretations to the original facts. By the time news reaches colonial backwards, it's been processed through so many colonial communication nodes that it resembles a game of telephone played by people who weren't entirely sure what the original message was supposed to be. Frontier news delivery requires travelling through colonial wilderness, where communication systems consist of whoever happens to be travelling in the right direction and remembers to pass along information that may or may not be important. Colonial frontier communication was basically hoping someone would eventually wander by with news from civilization, assuming anyone could agree on what constituted civilization. Coastal cities received news from Europe months before interior settlements, creating colonial information inequality, where your geographic location determines not just what you know, but when you know it. Colonial information access was basically a geographic lottery, where winners got to be wrong about current events earlier than losers. Different regions receive completely different versions of the same events, because colonial communication systems operated independently and had no mechanisms for quality control or accuracy verification. Colonial regional news was basically parallel universe reporting, where every location had its own version of reality. But you still haven't experienced the literacy challenges that complicated colonial news consumption, and that's where 1790 information processing reveals its educational barriers. Understanding colonial news requires literacy skills that many colonists haven't developed, making news consumption a class privilege disguised as civic participation. Colonial literacy was basically a luxury service available to people wealthy enough to afford education and leisure time for reading practice. Your town crier speaks in colonial official language that combines formal proclamation style with regional dialect, creating communication that sounds important but may be incomprehensible to people whose education consisted primarily of staying alive long enough to learn colonial survival skills. Colonial civic language was basically bureaucratic poetry performed by people who specialized in making simple information sound complicated. Written news, when available, uses colonial printing technology that produces text quality ranging from barely legible to completely illegible, printed on paper that has the durability of colonial promises and the clarity of colonial weather forecasts. Colonial printing was a bold business where readability was often optional and accuracy was purely coincidental. Colonial newspapers contain information presented in formats that assume readers have background knowledge about political systems, economic principles, and international relationships that many colonists lack. Colonial news consumption required educational prerequisites that colonial education systems hadn't provided to most colonial residents. Legal and political terminology in colonial news requires translation skills that most colonists haven't developed, making civic engagement an exercise in guessing what government officials meant when they used words that weren't part of normal colonial vocabulary. Colonial political language was basically code designed by people who forgot they were supposed to be communicating with regular citizens. But you still haven't experienced the religious implications of colonial news consumption. And that's where 1790 information gathering reveals its theological complications. Colonial news often contains information about events that challenge religious worldviews, political upheavals that contradict divine authority concepts, and social changes that conflict with colonial moral frameworks. Processing colonial news requires reconciling current events with religious beliefs in ways that colonial theology hadn't fully worked out. Religious leaders interpret news through colonial Christian perspectives that may or may not align with actual events, creating alternative information systems where civic news gets filtered through theological frameworks that prioritize spiritual correctness over factual accuracy. Colonial religious news interpretation was basically fact-checking through prayer and hoping divine inspiration would clarify confusing current events. Sunday sermons incorporate current events in ways that transform news into moral instruction, political commentary, and spiritual guidance that may completely alter the original information content. Colonial pulpit news was basically remixed culture applied to current events by people who specialized in finding religious meaning in secular developments. Religious newspapers present news through denominational perspectives that create competing versions of the same events, each filtered through different theological interpretations that may be mutually contradictory. Colonial religious media was basically partisan news with divine authority claims and scriptural supporting evidence. Colonial moral frameworks require evaluating news content for spiritual implications, political correctness according to religious standards, and social acceptability within church community standards. Colonial news consumption was basically content moderation performed by individual conscience, trained through colonial religious education. But you still haven't experienced the economic information processing challenges that made colonial news consumption a financial literacy test. And that's where 1790 current events reveal their commercial complications. Understanding economic news requires knowledge of colonial financial systems, international trade relationships, and currency mechanisms that most colonists encounter only when these systems directly affect their personal economic disasters. Colonial economic literacy was basically learning about money by watching it disappear through colonial economic forces beyond individual control. Trade news involves commercial relationships between countries you've never heard of, affecting products you don't use, through economic mechanisms that colonial education never explained. Colonial international commerce was basically global economic weather that occasionally produced local storms without warning or apparent cause. Currency information requires understanding multiple colonial monetary systems that operate simultaneously and often contradict each other in value, availability, and acceptability. Colonial money was basically a collection of competing currencies where exchange rates change faster than colonial communication could track the changes. Financial news about government debt, taxation policies, and public spending requires mathematical literacy that colonial education systems rarely provided to people whose economic participation consisted primarily of trying not to starve. Colonial fiscal policy was basically government mathematics, performed by people who forgot to explain the calculations to citizens who would be paying for the results. Commercial regulations announced through colonial news affect colonial business operations in ways that require legal interpretation skills that most colonial entrepreneurs lack. Colonial business law was basically government suggestions with enforcement mechanisms that nobody fully understood until after they'd been violated. But you still haven't experienced the international news processing challenges that made colonial foreign policy understanding an exercise in global guesswork. And that's where 1790 world events reveal their geographic complexities. European news reaches colonial America through communication chains that pass through multiple countries, languages, and political interpretations before reaching your Philadelphia street corner. Colonial international news was basically information archaeology, where original facts were buried under layers of translation, interpretation, and creative misunderstanding. Military conflicts in Europe affect colonial economic relationships in ways that won't become apparent for months, making current international news essentially useless for colonial planning purposes. Colonial international relations were basically playing chess with pieces that moved according to rules that changed while you weren't looking. Diplomatic developments between European powers create consequences for colonial trade, immigration, and political relationships that require understanding international law, historical precedents, and cultural contexts that colonial education never covered. Colonial international awareness was basically trying to follow soap opera plots involving characters you'd never met speaking languages you didn't understand. Colonial foreign policy decisions are made by government officials who have access to information that regular colonists never see, creating democratic participation in international affairs based on incomplete information about complex situations. Colonial international democracy was basically voting for foreign policy decisions while blindfolded and hoping elected officials knew more than their constituents did. European economic developments affect colonial prosperity through commercial mechanisms that operate on timescales longer than colonial memory, and through cause and effect relationships that colonial economic theory couldn't adequately explain. Colonial international economics was basically weather forecasting for financial storms that might arrive without warning from overseas. But you still haven't experienced the technological limitations that made colonial news consumption a monument to communication inefficiency. And that's where 1790 information technology reveals its creative approaches to failure. Colonial printing technology operates on principles that prioritize quantity over quality, producing newspapers that look like they were created by people who had heard about printing but never actually seen it done properly. Colonial printing was basically document production through educated guessing and hoping the results would be readable enough to justify the effort. Transportation systems for news delivery rely on colonial road networks that exist primarily in the imagination of colonial planners who had optimistic views about what constituted a road. Colonial news transportation was basically information delivery through obstacle courses designed by people who actively hated efficient communication. Weather affects colonial communication systems in ways that modern people cannot comprehend, where seasonal changes could isolate entire communities for months and make news delivery dependent on climate conditions that nobody could predict or control. Colonial weather was basically information warfare conducted by atmospheric forces that didn't care about human communication needs. Colonial communication storage systems consist of human memory, which operates with the reliability of colonial everything else, meaning information accuracy decreases over time and through repetition in ways that would fascinate colonial scientists if colonial science were better at understanding anything. Colonial information storage was basically hoping people would remember things correctly long enough to pass them along before they forgot the important details. The entire colonial communication system operates without backup mechanisms, quality control procedures, or error correction capabilities, making news consumption basically an act of faith in human reliability and natural cooperation forces that had no particular interest in ensuring accurate information transfer. Your colonial news consumption experience represents participation in humanity's most ambitious attempt to create reliable communication systems using unreliable technology operated by unreliable people under unreliable conditions for unreliable purposes. Colonial communication was basically collective optimism disguised as information technology, where the goal was moving some form of information from somewhere to somewhere else before everyone involved died of old age or colonial working conditions. Street corner news gathering in 1790 wasn't media consumption, it was information archaeology, conducted in public under adverse conditions by people who understood that staying uninformed was even worse than being misinformed, even when being misinformed was guaranteed and staying informed was essentially impossible. Colonial current events were indeed a bold business, and results varied from barely adequate to completely useless, but the system somehow worked well enough to keep colonial society functioning until better communication technology was eventually invented by people who had learned from colonial communication failures. Congratulations, it's medieval times and you need soap, which means you're about to embark on a journey that transforms animal fat and wood ashes into something that barely qualifies as cleaning material through a process that involves more suffering than actual chemistry. Forget everything you think you know about soap making from modern craft tutorials. You're about to experience medieval hygiene production, where the ingredients are disgusting, the process is dangerous, and the results make you question whether being clean is worth this much misery. Your soap-making adventure begins with collecting the raw materials, which in medieval times means gathering substances that modern people would consider biohazardous waste and treating them like precious commodities. Medieval soap wasn't made from pleasant ingredients. It was created from the leftover parts of animals that had been used for everything else, combined with the inorganic remains of whatever you could burn. The fat you need for soap making doesn't come from a neat package at the medieval grocery store, but it comes from slaughtering animals and carefully collecting the adipose tissue that surrounds their organs. This isn't the pleasant white fat you might imagine. This is yellowish, greyish, sometimes pinkish animal tissue that comes with its own ecosystem of smells, textures and biological complications that would make modern people question their commitment to cleanliness. Collecting animal fat requires butchering skills that medieval people developed through necessity and practiced through desperation. You're not just cutting meat, you're conducting medieval surgery on dead animals to extract the specific tissues that might eventually become soap, assuming you survive the process and don't die from any of the numerous medieval diseases that came from handling decomposing organic matter with medieval sanitation practices. The fat collection process involves scraping, cutting, and separating tissue using tools that have been used for multiple purposes and cleaned with medieval standards that would horrify modern health inspectors. Your knives are sharp enough to remove fat, but dull enough to make the process unnecessarily difficult, and your cutting surface is whatever flat object you can find that won't immediately poison your soap ingredients. But you still haven't experienced the ash collection process, and that's where medieval soap making really shows its commitment to making cleaning supplies from materials that seem designed to be anything except cleaning supplies. Your ash supply doesn't come from a medieval ash store. It comes from burning everything organic that you can find and carefully collecting the mineral residue that remains after fire has consumed all the burnable material. Medieval ash production was basically controlled destruction conducted for constructive purposes, assuming you could control the destruction and the purposes remained constructive. Wood ash collection requires maintaining fires that burn consistently enough to produce useful ash while avoiding fires that burn so enthusiastically that they consume your house, your neighbors' houses, and everything else in your medieval community. Medieval fire management was a bold business where the line between useful combustion and catastrophic combustion was determined by medieval physics and luck in roughly equal proportions. The quality of your ash depends on what you burn to create it, and medieval fuel sources included whatever organic material was available, which might be hardwood, softwood, animal dung, agricultural waste, or mysterious organic substances that you found lying around and decided to test for flammability. Medieval fuel science was basically experimental combustion performed by people who learned about fire safety through trial and error, mostly error. Different types of ash produce different soap qualities, but determining which ash works best requires medieval chemistry knowledge that most people acquired through experimentation that often resulted in soap that was worse than no soap at all. Medieval ash chemistry was basically guessing with combustible materials and hoping the results would be useful rather than toxic. Collecting ash involves sifting through fire residue to separate usable mineral content from charcoal, unburned organic matter, and various substances that weren't supposed to be in your fire, but ended up there anyway. Your ash collection process resembles archaeological excavation conducted on the remains of controlled disasters, but you still haven't experienced the fat rendering process. And that's where medieval soap making transforms from gathering disgusting materials to actively processing them into even more disgusting intermediate products. Fat rendering isn't cooking. It's slowly melting animal tissue over controlled heat until the solid fat becomes liquid fat, releasing aromas that would make medieval people nostalgic for the pleasant smell of their regular body odor. Medieval fat rendering was basically aromatherapy designed by people who had never heard of pleasant aromas and thought that all scents should be memorable rather than enjoyable. Your rendering process requires maintaining consistent heat that's hot enough to melt fat, but not so hot that it burns the fat, catches fire, or produces smoke that alerts your neighbors to the fact that you're conducting medieval chemistry experiments that might kill everyone in the vicinity. Medieval temperature control was basically guessing with fire and hoping that your medieval intuition about heat management was better than your medieval understanding of combustion physics. The fat melting process produces liquid that bubbles, splatters, and occasionally explodes in small quantities that remind you that medieval soap making was basically controlled chemistry conducted by people who didn't understand chemistry but needed soap badly enough to risk accidental self-destruction. Medieval fat rendering involved constant vigilance against fat-based explosions that could blind you, burn you, or cover you in hot animal fat that would create its own set of medieval medical emergencies. Rendering fat requires stirring with tools that can withstand hot fat without melting, breaking, or contributing unwanted flavors to your soap base. Medieval fat stirring implements were basically heat-resistant tools created by people who understood metallurgy well enough to make stirring equipment, but not well enough to make the process safe or pleasant. The rendered fat needs to be strained to remove bits of meat, bone, skin, and various organic debris that came along with the fat during the collection process. Medieval fat straining was basically quality control performed on substances that had questionable quality to begin with, using straining technology that consisted of whatever fabric was available and hadn't been destroyed by previous medieval chemistry experiments. But you still haven't experienced the lye-making process, and that's where medieval soap making reveals its commitment to creating caustic chemicals through methods that seem designed to injure the soap maker. Lye production involves combining your collected ash with water in proportions that create a chemical solution strong enough to dissolve organic matter, including your skin if you get the ratios wrong. Medieval lye making was basically chemistry for people who learned about chemical reactions through personal injury and hoped that experience would eventually teach them proper procedures. Your lye making container needs to be something that won't be dissolved by the caustic solution you're creating, which eliminates most medieval container options and leaves you with pottery or metal vessels that may or may not be suitable for containing chemicals that could eat through medieval infrastructure. Medieval chemical containment was a bold business where container failure could result in chemical spills that dissolved whatever they contacted. Testing lye strength requires methods that medieval science hadn't fully developed, so you determine chemical concentration through techniques that involve floating eggs, tasting small amounts, or observing how quickly the lye dissolves organic test materials. Medieval chemical analysis was basically educated guessing with dangerous substances, where wrong guesses could result in soap that didn't work or lye that worked too well and dissolve things that weren't supposed to be dissolved. The lye production process releases vapors that attack your respiratory system, eyes, and any exposed skin, creating a working environment that resembles a medieval chemical warfare training facility operated by people who hadn't heard of safety equipment. Medieval lye making required holding your breath while working with substances that actively tried to injure you through multiple simultaneous attack vectors. Water quality affects lye production in ways that medieval water science couldn't adequately predict, meaning your lye strength varied depending on what had been in your water before you used it for soap making. Medieval water chemistry was basically hoping that whatever was in your water would contribute positively to your soap, rather than creating chemical combinations that produced unexpected reactions. But you still haven't experienced the actual soap-making process. And that's where medieval chemistry reveals its creative approaches to combining caustic chemicals with animal fat to create cleaning products. Combining lye with rendered fat requires precise timing that medieval timekeeping couldn't measure accurately, creating soap-making schedules that operated on medieval intuition about when chemical reactions had proceeded far enough to produce useful results. Medieval soap timing was basically chemistry performed by people who determined reaction completion through observation of bubbling, color changes, and aromatic developments that might indicate success or impending chemical disaster. The saponification process involves chemical reactions that medieval science couldn't explain, but medieval experience had demonstrated would occasionally produce useful results, if conducted under the right conditions with the right materials in the right proportions. Medieval soap chemistry was basically alchemy that occasionally worked, performed by people who didn't understand why it worked, but needed soap badly enough to keep trying until something useful happened. Temperature control during soap making requires maintaining heat levels that keep the chemical reaction active without overheating the mixture to the point where it catches fire, explodes, or produces toxic vapors that could kill everyone in the vicinity. Medieval soap making was basically controlled chemistry, conducted near open flames by people wearing flammable clothing while working with combustible chemicals. Stirring the soap mixture requires constant attention because medieval soap chemistry operated on the principle that stopping stirring at the wrong moment could ruin hours of work and waste precious ingredients that had taken days to collect and process. Medieval soap stirring was basically meditation conducted with chemical weapons, while standing near fire and hoping that continuous motion would eventually produce useful results. The soap mixture needs to be stirred until it reaches the right consistency, which medieval soap makers determined through visual and textural cues that required experience to interpret correctly. Medieval soap consistency evaluation was basically chemistry performed through sensory analysis by people whose chemical education consisted of previous soap-making disasters that had taught them what not to do. But you still haven't experienced the soap curing process, and that's where medieval soap making reveals its commitment to delayed gratification through extended chemical uncertainty. Freshly made soap isn't ready to use minds. It requires aging that allows the chemical reactions to complete, and the excess lye to neutralize through exposure to air, moisture, and time. Medieval soap curing was basically chemistry that continued happening after you thought you were finished making soap, requiring patience that medieval life rarely afforded and storage space that medieval living arrangements couldn't easily provide. Your soap curing area needs to be dry enough to prevent spoilage, but humid enough to allow proper chemical completion, protected from weather but exposed to air circulation, and secure from animals that might be attracted to soap ingredients but not informed about soap chemistry. Medieval soap storage was basically creating ideal conditions for chemical reactions in environments that were ideal for nothing. Curing soap requires checking its progress regularly to determine whether the chemical reactions are proceeding correctly, or whether your soap is developing problems that will make it useless for cleaning and potentially dangerous for human contact. Medieval soap quality control was basically ongoing chemistry observation conducted by people who had to guess whether their soap was improving or deteriorating based on changes in color, texture, smell, and chemical reactivity. The soap aging process can take weeks or months, during which time your soap investment is vulnerable to weather damage, animal interference, theft by neighbors who need soap, and chemical degradation that could turn your cleaning supplies into hazardous waste. Medieval soap storage was basically long-term chemistry gambling, where the payoff required surviving the storage period without losing your chemical investment. Different soap batches cure at different rates depending on the fat quality, lye strength, mixing thoroughness, storage conditions, and various factors that medieval soap science couldn't predict or control. Medieval soap curing was basically chemistry performed through hope and observation, where successful soap production required luck that medieval life rarely provided. But you still haven't experienced the soap testing process, and that's where medieval soap making reveals whether your chemical experiment produced cleaning supplies or expensive caustic waste. Testing medieval soap requires using it on your skin, which means applying chemical products to your body before knowing whether those products are safe for human contact. Medieval soap testing was basically human experimentation conducted on yourself with chemicals that you made using procedures that you learned through trial and error. Safe soap produces mild cleaning action without burning your skin, dissolving your clothing, or creating chemical reactions that damage whatever you're trying to clean. Medieval soap safety evaluation was basically chemistry performed through personal injury assessment, where successful soap didn't cause immediate medical emergencies. Unsuccessful soap might be too caustic and burn your skin, too weak and provide no cleaning benefit, or chemically unstable and produce unexpected reactions when exposed to water, skin oils, or atmospheric conditions. Medieval soap failure could range from disappointingly useless to actively dangerous, with no way to predict which type of failure you'd achieved until you tested the final product. Your soap testing process involves gradually increasing contact with your skin while monitoring for chemical burns, allergic reactions, skin irritation, or other medical complications that suggest your soap-making experiment produced cleaning supplies that were more dangerous than the dirt they were supposed to remove. Medieval soap evaluation was basically medical research conducted on yourself with chemicals that might not be suitable for human use. Successful soap production means you've created cleaning supplies that work better than water alone without causing chemical injuries that require medieval medical attention. Medieval soap success was basically chemistry that achieved modest goals without creating major problems, which represented significant achievement in medieval chemical manufacturing. But you still haven't experienced the broader implications of medieval soap making, and that's where creating cleaning supplies from ash and fat reveals its position in medieval domestic economics and social hierarchy. Soap making requires time, materials, skills, and resources that many medieval people couldn't afford to invest in cleaning supplies, making soap a luxury commodity that represented significant investment in personal hygiene and social status. Medieval soap was basically expensive chemistry for people wealthy enough to afford the raw materials and patient enough to wait for the results. Successful soap makers could trade their products for other goods, creating medieval chemical industries based on transforming waste products into valuable commodities through processes that most people couldn't or wouldn't attempt. Medieval soap making was basically small-scale manufacturing that turned garbage into gold, assuming you survived the manufacturing process and produced products that people wanted to buy. The social implications of soap ownership included improved hygiene, enhanced social acceptability, and increased personal comfort, but also required ongoing investment in soap production or soap purchasing that competed with other medieval survival priorities. Medieval soap consumption was basically choosing between cleanliness and other forms of medieval comfort, both of which were expensive and difficult to maintain. Soap-making knowledge represented valuable skills that could provide economic opportunities, but also required accepting the risks associated with medieval chemistry performed without safety equipment or adequate understanding of chemical processes. Medieval soap-making expertise was basically specialized knowledge that could improve your life if it didn't kill you first. Your medieval soap-making experience isn't just creating cleaning supplies, it's participating in medieval chemistry that transforms waste products into useful commodities through processes that seem designed to injure the chemist, while producing results that barely justify the effort required to create them. Medieval soap making was basically alchemy that occasionally worked, performed by people who needed soap badly enough to risk accidental self-destruction through primitive chemistry. Medieval soap production was a bold business where success meant creating cleaning supplies that worked better than nothing without causing chemical injuries that were worse than being dirty. Results varied considerably, but somehow people managed to produce enough soap to maintain basic hygiene standards while surviving the soap-making process, which suggests either incredible medieval determination or extraordinary medieval luck. Soap making from ashes and fat wasn't just medieval chemistry, it was medieval optimism disguised as chemical manufacturing, where the goal was transforming disgusting raw materials into useful products through processes that were barely controlled and rarely safe. Medieval soap makers were basically chemical pioneers who learned through experience that cleanliness was possible, but expensive, dangerous, and required more chemistry knowledge than medieval education typically provided.